Although it may be counterintuitive at first, there actually was a time when Jews were expelled from a kingdom of Israel. To some it may sound unreal or even absurd, but actually this was the event that gave birth to the legendary 10 lost tribes of Israel. However, to understand fully the context, we have to start from the death of King Solomon in approximately 931 BC, as it terminated an era of centralized administration and territorial expansion, revealing deep-seated structural weaknesses within the Hebrew state. While the reign of Solomon was characterized by the construction of monumental architecture and the establishment of a standing professional army, these achievements were predicated on a rigorous system of internal taxation and mandated labor. The fiscal policies required to sustain the royal court and its defensive infrastructure placed a disproportionate burden on the northern tribes, who lacked the administrative influence enjoyed by the southern elite. This regional imbalance created a volatile political environment that awaited only a transition in leadership to erupt into open defiance. Upon the death of the monarch, his son Rehoboam traveled to the northern assembly site of Shechem to secure the formal allegiance of the tribal representatives. At this convocation, the northern delegates, led by a former official named Jeroboam, who had recently returned from political exile, presented a formal petition for economic relief. They demanded a significant reduction in the labor requirements and tax levies that had defined the previous administration. Rehoboam's response to this grievance proved to be the pivotal administrative failure of the era. Rather than adopting the conciliatory advice offered by his senior counselors, who advocated for a moderate fiscal policy to ensure national stability, the young king followed the counsel of his younger associates. He issued a public declaration asserting his intent to intensify the regulatory and financial burdens on the populace, threatening even more severe penalties for non-compliance. This refusal to address tribal grievances catalyzed an immediate and irreversible political withdrawal. The 10 northern tribes rejected the authority of the Davidic line, declaring their independence from the central government in Jerusalem. They appointed Jeroboam as their sovereign, establishing the northern kingdom of Israel as a separate political and military entity. This terminal rupture dismantled the unified monarchy, leaving the southern kingdom of Judah isolated. The resulting division created a permanent state of geopolitical vulnerability, as 2 smaller competing kingdoms replaced a single regional power, setting the stage for centuries of conflict that would eventually attract the attention of the expanding Assyrian Empire. The formal establishment of 2 independent political jurisdictions necessitated a comprehensive restructuring of the regional administrative landscape. This fracture was not merely a change in dynastic loyalty, but a systematic divergence in governance, models, and economic priorities. The northern kingdom of Israel immediately functioned as the larger and more populous entity, possessing superior agricultural resources and control over the primary international trade routes connecting Egypt to the northern empires. In contrast, the southern kingdom of Judah retained the traditional capital and the centralized religious infrastructure, yet found itself geographically constrained and economically isolated. This imbalance ensured that the 2 states would develop distinct military strategies and diplomatic alignments. The northern administration under its new sovereign prioritized the legitimization of its authority by establishing new centers of governance. To replace the administrative centrality of Jerusalem, the northern kingdom developed major urban sites such as Shechem and Tirzah, before eventually centralizing power in the heavily fortified city of Samaria. To prevent the northern populace from maintaining political or religious ties to the southern capital, a parallel system of worship was instituted, featuring designated sanctuaries that served as national symbols of autonomy. These institutional changes effectively terminated the historical cohesion of the Hebrew tribes, creating a permanent border that was frequently contested through armed skirmishes and tactical incursions. The geopolitical consequences of this schism were profound. The northern kingdom's proximity to powerful neighbors required a more active and often aggressive foreign policy, leading it to form complex alliances with local powers. Meanwhile, the Southern Kingdom adopted a more conservative and isolationist posture, relying on its rugged terrain for defense. The loss of a unified military command meant that neither state could effectively resist the encroachment of larger imperial forces on their own. This lack of strategic coordination transformed the region into a fragmented buffer zone. The resulting internal competition for resources and prestige further depleted the military readiness of both kingdoms, creating a political vacuum that would eventually be exploited by external aggressors seeking to control the strategic corridors of the Levant. But why did it all end with the expulsion of Jews? And did they actually deserve it? The Northern Kingdom of Israel was defined by a demographic coalition consisting of 10 ancestral tribes, creating a social structure distinct from the dynastic continuity of the South. This confederation included the territories of Reuben, Gad, Issachar, Zebulun, Dan, Naphtali, Asher, Simeon, and the influential Josephite lineages of Ephraim and Manasseh. The inclusion of these specific groups provided the state with a diverse human resource base, ranging from the nomadic pastoralists of the eastern frontier to the urbanized mercantile classes along the coast. By consolidating these disparate tribal units, the Northern monarchy achieved a level of internal complexity that facilitated rapid urbanization and the development of a sophisticated military bureaucracy. The political identity of this coalition was characterized by a departure from the hereditary exclusivity of the Southern administration, while the South remained tethered to a single royal line. The Northern Kingdom experienced a series of internal transitions where leadership was often determined by military success or regional influence, rather than lineage alone. This fluidity allowed for the rise of various ruling houses, such as the Omrides, who focused on expanding the state's regional footprint through strategic marital alliances and commercial treaties. The northern tribes also possessed a unique legal and social tradition that emphasized localized autonomy, often clashing with the centralizing efforts of the Sumerian court. This tension between tribal independence and royal authority was a persistent feature of northern governance. Demographically, the Northern Kingdom maintained a significantly higher population density than its southern neighbor. The presence of large-scale olive oil and wine production facilities in the hill country of Ephraim served as the backbone of an export-oriented economy. Furthermore, the northern tribes controlled the access points to the Jezreel Valley, the most productive agricultural region in the Levant. This economic strength allowed the state to sustain a large standing army and commission extensive fortification projects in cities like Megiddo and Hazor. However, this same prosperity made the Northern Kingdom a primary target for the expanding empires of the North. The very resources that fueled the rise of the 10 tribes also ensured they would remain at the center of regional conflicts, eventually drawing the attention of the Assyrian military machine. For approximately 200 years following the initial fracture, the relationship between the kingdoms of Israel and Judah was defined by a cycle of systemic conflict punctuated by brief periods of pragmatic cooperation. This era of bilateral instability was driven by the unresolved question of regional hegemony and the competition for control over the central Benjaminite territory, which served as the primary buffer zone between the two states. Military engagements were frequent and localized, often involving the fortification of border towns like Geba and Mizpah to secure tactical advantages. These hostilities prevented the emergence of a unified Hebrew defense, ensuring that both monarchies remained focused on internal security rather than the mounting external threats from the north and east. Despite this persistent state of friction, the two kingdoms occasionally formed temporary strategic alliances to address shared existential dangers. A notable example occurred during the mid-9th century BC, when the northern and southern forces combined their military assets to resist the southward expansion of the Syrian state, based in Damascus. This cooperation often took the form of joint expeditions to reclaim lost border territories or to secure vital agricultural regions. Furthermore, marital treaties between the ruling houses occasionally provided a thin layer of diplomatic stability, though these arrangements rarely survived the transition of individual monarchs. These periods of collaboration were not driven by an idealistic return to unity, but by a cold assessment of mutual survival in a volatile regional ecology. The cumulative impact of this sustained rivalry was the gradual erosion of the material and human resources of both states. The continuous expenditure on defensive infrastructure and the maintenance of large standing armies diverted capital away from long-term economic development. While the Northern Kingdom frequently dominated the military balance due to its larger population and superior technology, the Southern Kingdom leveraged its rugged topography to maintain a defensive stalemate. This persistent state of low-intensity warfare effectively paralyzed the region's ability to coordinate a grand strategy against the rising Neo-Assyrian Empire. By the time the Assyrians arrived in the Levant, they encountered two exhausted and socially divided kingdoms that viewed each other with as much suspicion as they did the foreign invader. The physical orientation of the Northern Kingdom of Israel provided a unique set of strategic advantages and terminal vulnerabilities that dictated its eventual collapse. Unlike the southern state, which was shielded by the rugged Judean wilderness, the northern territory was characterized by open plains and accessible mountain passes. This permeability facilitated the rapid movement of international caravans along the coastal highway and the King's Highway, but it simultaneously offered unobstructed corridors for invading imperial armies. The state's northern frontier lacked a significant natural barrier, placing its primary population centers within the immediate reach of the Syrian and Assyrian military machines. The capital city of Samaria, established by King Omri in the early 9th century BC, was situated on a prominent hill that allowed for exceptional visual command of the surrounding valleys. This location was chosen specifically for its defensive potential, as the steep incline forced any besieging force to engage in a costly uphill ascent. Samaria functioned as the nerve center of a highly centralized administrative system, housing the royal archives, the treasury, and the primary military garrison. The city's architectural layout, featuring massive ashlar masonry and sophisticated water management systems, reflected the state's ability to mobilize significant technical and labor resources. However, the capital's reliance on the surrounding agricultural hinterland meant that any prolonged blockade could effectively sever its vital supply lines. Economically, the Northern Kingdom's geography supported a level of material wealth that surpassed its southern neighbor. The Jezreel Valley functioned as a critical agricultural engine, providing the surplus grain necessary to sustain a non-productive urban elite and a professional military class. Furthermore, the kingdom's control over the northern highlands allowed for the industrial-scale production of olive oil and wine, which were exported to regional markets. This concentration of resources attracted the predatory interest of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which viewed the northern kingdom as a lucrative source of tribute and a strategic gateway to the Mediterranean coast. While the terrain allowed for initial prosperity, it ultimately failed to provide the geographic depth required to survive a sustained imperial campaign. The very roads that brought wealth to Samaria would eventually carry the Assyrian legions directly to the heart of the kingdom. The mid-8th century BC witnessed a fundamental reorganization of the Assyrian state, transitioning from a regional power into a centralized imperial machine capable of sustained transcontinental expansion. This resurgence, often characterized as the Neo-Assyrian Awakening, was driven by a series of internal administrative reforms that enhanced the monarchy's ability to extract resources and mobilize manpower. Central to this transformation was the creation of a permanent, professional standing army, which replaced the traditional seasonal levies of the previous centuries. This military evolution allowed for year-round campaigning and the development of specialized units, including advanced siege corps and elite cavalry divisions, which provided the empire with a decisive technological advantage over the smaller monarchies of the Levant. This period of renewed vigor fundamentally destabilized the geopolitical equilibrium of the Near East. The Assyrian state adopted a rigorous fiscal policy that demanded absolute submission from neighboring territories, enforced through the implementation of a systematic provincial administration. Local rulers were integrated into a tiered hierarchy of dependency, where the failure to provide mandated levies or labor resulted in immediate military intervention. The empire's bureaucratic apparatus produced meticulous records of these transactions, ensuring that every conquered district contributed to the maintenance of the central treasury in Nineveh. This relentless pursuit of capital and commodities transformed the nature of regional diplomacy, as traditional alliances were shattered by the overwhelming threat of Assyrian reprisal. The expansionist drive of the Neo-Assyrian Empire was not merely a pursuit of territory, but a quest for the total control of international commercial corridors. By securing the major transit points of the Fertile Crescent, the Assyrian administration gained direct access to the luxury markets of the Mediterranean and the raw materials of the northern highlands. The imposition of imperial tolls and the regulation of maritime trade further augmented the state's liquid wealth. This systemic accumulation of power created an existential challenge for the northern kingdom of Israel, which occupied a critical node in the empire's planned western expansion. As the Assyrian military machine turned its attention toward the coastal states, the historical independence of the northern tribes was replaced by a state of permanent imperial surveillance, signaling the commencement of a terminal conflict for regional survival. The accession of Tiglath-Pileser III in 745 BC inaugurated a period of aggressive and uncompromising territorial consolidation that shifted the focus of the Assyrian state toward the permanent annexation of the Levant. Unlike his predecessors, who often relied on punitive raids and temporary tribute extraction, this monarch implemented a systematic policy of political integration. He restructured the empire's administrative hierarchy by reducing the power of local governors and concentrating authority within a centralized military council. This restructuring ensured that the resources of the state were directed toward a policy of total conquest rather than maintaining distant, semi-autonomous buffer zones. The imperial expansion was no longer a series of isolated campaigns, but a continuous process of incorporating sovereign kingdoms into a unified provincial network. In his drive toward the Mediterranean, Tiglath-Pileser III introduced a sophisticated logistical system that allowed the Assyrian legions to maintain long-term operations far from the heartland. This included the establishment of a network of fortified supply depots and the use of specialized intelligence units to monitor the movements of regional coalitions. The monarch utilized a strategy of phased annexation, where a rebellious territory was first reduced to a state of heavy vassalage before being converted into an official Assyrian province under the direct control of a royal appointee. This method allowed the empire to systematically dismantle the political infrastructure of the Levantine states, including the northern kingdom of Israel. The specific threat to the northern tribes became manifest during the monarch's western campaigns, as he bypassed traditional diplomatic channels to demand the immediate surrender of strategic coastal assets. Under his command, the Assyrian military engaged in the large-scale redistribution of populations to weaken the cultural cohesion of conquered regions. This period saw the first significant loss of northern Israelite territory, as the northern and eastern districts were detached from the kingdom and placed under Assyrian jurisdiction. By the end of his reign, the northern kingdom of Israel was reduced to a truncated state, its primary agricultural and commercial centers under foreign oversight. The administrative precedents established during this era created the framework for the final liquidation of the kingdom, ensuring that any subsequent attempt at independence would be met with total and permanent removal. The supremacy of the Assyrian state was anchored in a revolutionary military doctrine that combined industrial-scale logistical support with advanced engineering and standardized tactical units. While contemporary Levantine armies relied on seasonal conscription and traditional weaponry, the Assyrian military functioned as a permanent, highly specialized machine. The introduction of iron weaponry on a massive scale provided a significant edge in durability and lethality over the bronze equipment utilized by many of its adversaries. This technological advantage was augmented by the development of the composite bow, which offered superior range and penetration. allowing Assyrian archers to suppress enemy forces before the commencement of close-quarters engagement. The Assyrian Engineering Corps was arguably the most critical component of this war machine, specializing in the science of polyorcetics, or the art of the siege. They developed sophisticated equipment, including massive multi-story battering rams protected by fire-resistant leather carapaces and mobile towers that allowed infantry to clear city walls from a position of relative safety. These units could rapidly construct earthen ramps and tunnels to compromise the structural integrity of stone fortifications, rendering even the most heavily defended urban centers, such as Samaria, vulnerable to direct assault. The ability to overcome geographic and architectural obstacles with such speed ensured that no city in the northern kingdom of Israel could rely indefinitely on its physical defenses. Tactically, the army utilized a diverse array of specialized divisions, including heavy chariotry for shock maneuvers and light cavalry for rapid pursuit and reconnaissance. The coordination between these units was maintained through an efficient command structure and a signal system that allowed for real-time communication across the battlefield. Furthermore, the Assyrian administration implemented a standardized kit and training regimen for its soldiers, ensuring a level of discipline and cohesion previously unseen in Near Eastern warfare. This systematic approach to combat turned the act of expansion into a predictable and repeatable process. The military was not merely a tool for destruction, but a mechanism for imposing a new imperial order, utilizing psychological intimidation and overwhelming force to secure the total submission of the Levantine states. The Assyrian administration utilized mass deportation as a foundational tool of imperial governance, intended to achieve the permanent demographic and political neutralization of conquered territories. This policy was executed with bureaucratic precision, involving the large-scale movement of families, specialized laborers, and community leaders across the vast distances of the empire. The primary objective was to terminate the connection between a population and its ancestral land, thereby dismantling the regional loyalties that historically fueled insurgencies against the central authority. By removing the individuals who comprised the social and intellectual core of a state, the Assyrian monarchy ensured that any remaining peasantry lacked the leadership necessary to coordinate future resistance. This systematic displacement served a dual economic function, acting as a mechanism for the redistribution of human capital to the empire's underdeveloped frontiers. Deportees were often funneled into large-scale state projects, including the construction of imperial capitals and the expansion of irrigation networks in the Mesopotamian heartland. Specialized craftsmen and military personnel from the northern kingdom of Israel were integrated into the Assyrian Technical Corps, ensuring that their skills directly augmented the power of the sovereign. This process turned a rebellious population into a productive asset, contributing to the agricultural and industrial output of the central state. The empire's meticulous records and census data allowed administrators to monitor these new arrivals, ensuring their complete absorption into the imperial fiscal system. Furthermore, the doctrine of deportation involved a secondary phase of repopulation, where foreign captives from distant regions were settled in the vacated territories. This created a fractured social landscape characterized by linguistic and cultural diversity, preventing the emergence of a unified national identity in the strategic borderlands. In the northern kingdom of Israel, this policy resulted in the introduction of diverse groups from Babylon and the northern mountains, who were tasked with maintaining the agricultural infrastructure under the supervision of Assyrian officials. This demographic engineering ensured that the provincial administration remained the only cohesive governing force in the region. The resulting loss of cultural continuity was terminal, as the original tribal structures were replaced by a fragmented colonial society that owed its survival and legal status solely to the Assyrian throne. The Assyrian imperial model transformed mass relocation from a punitive measure into a comprehensive program of socio-economic assimilation, ensuring that every displaced individual became a functional component of the state's logistical and military infrastructure. This transition was facilitated by a legal framework that granted deportees the status of royal subjects, effectively equalizing their position with that of the indigenous Assyrian population in the eyes of the central administration. By removing the barriers of provincial origin, the monarchy created a homogeneous labor force that was directly accountable to the throne. This standardization of legal standing allowed the government to bypass traditional local hierarchies, replacing tribal loyalty with a singular obligation to the imperial sovereign. Economically, the integration of these diverse populations was essential for the maintenance of the empire's agricultural and industrial outputs. The state directed large numbers of relocated families to the marginal territories of the Mesopotamian heartland, where they were tasked with the cultivation of previously unused land. These new agricultural colonies functioned as permanent supply nodes, providing the grain and livestock necessary to sustain the growing urban centers and the standing professional army. The central bureaucracy provided these settlers with the necessary tools and seed, ensuring that their labor was immediately productive. Furthermore, the mandatory use of a common language across the empire facilitated the exchange of goods and information, allowing disparate groups to operate within a unified commercial network. The military integration of foreign captives was equally systematic, as the Assyrian command incorporated specialized units from the northern kingdom of Israel directly into the royal army. Displaced infantry, charioteers, and scouts were professionalized and stationed in strategic garrisons across the empire, far from their points of origin. This strategic deployment ensured their loyalty, as their survival and status were entirely dependent on the continued stability of the Assyrian throne, rather than local ethnic ties. The military became a primary vehicle for assimilation, where standardized training and equipment erased regional distinctions. This functional integration ensured that the very people who once resisted Assyrian expansion became the guardians of its borders, providing the manpower necessary to sustain a transcontinental empire. The formal integration of the northern kingdom of Israel into the Assyrian imperial orbit was initiated through a system of unequal treaties that transformed the state into a subservient vassal. This preliminary stage of expansion allowed the Assyrian monarchy to extract significant wealth without the immediate necessity of a full-scale military occupation. The first recorded act of this political submission occurred during the mid-9th century BC, when the northern Israelite leadership provided a massive payment of bullion and luxury goods to ensure the continued survival of their administration. This transition represented a strategic shift where the kingdom surrendered its diplomatic autonomy in exchange for a fragile and conditional security. Under this vassalage framework, the Israelite monarchy was legally obligated to provide regular and substantial tribute, which functioned as a non-negotiable insurance against imperial invasion. These payments typically consisted of refined silver, gold vessels, and strategic raw materials, which were transported directly to the Assyrian heartland to fund the empire's administrative and military growth. The failure to meet these fiscal requirements was classified as an act of high treason, triggering immediate and punitive military intervention. This relationship institutionalized a state of permanent economic dependency, as the northern kingdom's surplus resources were redirected from domestic development to the maintenance of a foreign power. Politically, the status of a vassal state mandated the total synchronization of the northern kingdom's foreign policy with the interests of the Assyrian throne. The Israelite monarchs were prohibited from engaging in independent diplomacy with rival regional powers, effectively neutralizing the kingdom as a potential leader of anti-Assyrian coalitions. This diplomatic isolation ensured that the state remained a compliant buffer zone, securing the empire's western flank while its legions operated in other theaters. The presence of Assyrian observers and tax collectors within the northern administration provided the empire with detailed intelligence regarding the kingdom's internal defenses and resource capacity. This period of supervised subservience effectively hollowed out the northern kingdom's sovereign institutions, creating the administrative and fiscal preconditions for the total annexation that would follow. The sustained requirement for imperial tribute acted as a catalyst for a profound economic decline within the northern kingdom of Israel, transforming its internal social hierarchy and depleting its strategic reserves. These payments were not merely symbolic acts of submission, but were calculated extractions designed to ensure the fiscal exhaustion of the vassal state. To fulfill these non-negotiable obligations, the Israelite monarchy was forced to move beyond its traditional royal stores, initiating a mandatory and pervasive system of direct taxation on the private assets of its subjects. Historical data indicates that the central administration conducted a systematic audit of the landed gentry to identify individuals capable of contributing fixed amounts of silver toward the imperial requirement. During the 8th century BC, this took the form of an assessment where thousands of wealthy landowners were required to pay a substantial weight of precious metal to satisfy a single demand from the north. This rigorous extraction process created a permanent state of social volatility as the financial pressure moved downward through the population. The forced surrender of capital led to a significant reduction in domestic development, stifling the growth of local crafts and long-distance commercial ventures. Furthermore, the massive outflow of precious metals triggered a domestic liquidity crisis, making it increasingly difficult for the state to maintain its own civil infrastructure and internal security forces. The resulting degradation of the state apparatus meant that the kingdom became increasingly incapable of managing its own borders without foreign oversight. Beyond the purely financial impact, the burden of tribute fueled deep-seated internal resentment against the central authorities, as the populace viewed the governing class as an agent of foreign extraction. This erosion of social trust weakened the unity of the 10 tribes at a critical juncture. The wealth removed from the northern kingdom was directly utilized to bolster the imperial administrative centers and support the permanent garrisons stationed near the borders. This systematic drain on the kingdom's material and social resources ensured that when the imperial strategy transitioned to direct annexation, the state lacked the economic depth and civil coordination necessary to sustain a viable defense against a superior force. The systematic redirection of the northern kingdom's liquid assets toward the Mesopotamian heartland resulted in the complete paralysis of domestic mercantile activity. As bullion reserves were depleted to satisfy imperial demands, the internal credit systems that supported local commerce and agricultural production underwent a terminal contraction. This financial vacuum prevented the state from undertaking necessary repairs to its urban fortifications and public water systems, leading to a visible degradation of the kingdom's physical infrastructure. The lack of available capital meant that the once prosperous merchant guilds of the northern highlands could no longer finance long-distance trade ventures, effectively ceding control of the regional markets to foreign intermediaries. Furthermore, the Assyrian administration capitalized on this economic frailty by seizing direct control over the primary transit points along the coastal highway. By installing imperial customs officials at critical junctions, the empire ensured that the profits from international trade were siphoned off before reaching the Israelite treasury. This loss of commercial sovereignty meant that the northern kingdom was no longer an active participant in the Mediterranean economy, but merely a passive conduit for imperial wealth. The scarcity of refined silver forced a regression into primitive barter systems within the rural districts, stifling the development of specialized industries and manual crafts. The internal strain was compounded by a growing imbalance between the urban administrative centers and the agricultural hinterland. Farmers were frequently forced to surrender their seed grain and livestock to cover the widening fiscal deficit, resulting in a decline in total agricultural output and a rise in food insecurity. This erosion of the kingdom's productive base ensured that the state could no longer sustain the professional military hardware, such as chariots and advanced armor, necessary for independent defense. The northern kingdom's economy was transformed into a specialized extraction zone, wholly dedicated to fueling the growth of the Assyrian state. This state of financial strangulation left the monarchy with no strategic flexibility, rendering the political structure entirely dependent on the continued tolerance of the imperial throne. The rise of Hoshea to the throne of the northern kingdom in approximately 732 BC occurred through the violent removal of his predecessor Pekah during a period of extreme institutional decay. This transition of power was facilitated by the direct intervention of the central administration, which viewed the previous leadership's involvement in regional coalitions as a terminal violation of security. By executing the reigning monarch and assuming control, Hoshea positioned himself as a figure of stabilization within a political system that had recently lost its most productive northern and eastern provinces to foreign annexation. His administration inherited a state that was legally and geographically truncated, consisting primarily of the mountain districts of Ephraim and the capital city. Internal governance during these years was defined by a profound division among the Israelite leadership regarding the most viable path to survival. A significant faction within the court advocated for the immediate resumption of total autonomy, while others recognized the futility of resistance against a consolidated northern power. This internal struggle paralyzed the decision-making process, preventing the implementation of a coherent long-term defense policy. Hoshea's authority was further constrained by the need to maintain transparency with foreign observers, whose presence ensured that the administration remained accountable to the central treasury. The volatility of this era was amplified by the death of the reigning monarch Tiglath-Pileser III and the subsequent coronation of Shalmaneser V. Historically, such shifts in imperial leadership provided an incentive for subordinates to test the resolve of the new government. Hoshea's strategic options were limited by the total absence of a domestic military force capable of matching professionalized foreign legions. Despite the history of failed insurgencies, the court began to explore the possibility of support from the Egyptian Delta, where emerging dynasties sought to restore their own regional influence. This clandestine diplomacy, conducted while the kingdom remained under strict surveillance, represented a high-risk gamble intended to reclaim lost territories. The accession of Hoshea thus marked the commencement of a final and unstable administrative phase, where the pursuit of secret alliances directly conflicted with the state's formal obligations to the Mesopotamians. The decision to terminate the annual delivery of wealth to the Northern Empire in approximately 724 BC constituted a definitive act of political insurrection. This cessation of payment was not a consequence of internal fiscal exhaustion, but a deliberate rejection of the established treaty framework that had governed the region for decades. By intentionally withholding the mandated quantities of precious metals and agricultural products, the administration in Samaria signaled its transition from a compliant dependency to an active challenger of imperial authority. This move was predicated on a strategic assessment that the empire's internal transition between monarchs offered a temporary window of operational weakness. The Israelite leadership functioned under the assumption that a suspension of tribute would not trigger an immediate military mobilization, while the new administration in the north consolidated its domestic power. Simultaneously, the northern kingdom engaged in formal diplomatic outreach to the administrative centers of the Nile Delta, seeking a security guarantee that could counterbalance the overwhelming force of the Mesopotamian legions. This coordination involved the dispatch of official envoys to negotiate a mutual defense pact, based on the expectation that an Egyptian military presence would deter a punitive expedition from the north. However, this assessment failed to account for the fragmented nature of the Egyptian political landscape during this era, which prevented the rapid deployment of a professional expeditionary force. The reliance on foreign intervention as a substitute for domestic military capacity proved to be the terminal strategic error of the Sumerian court. The Imperial Intelligence Network, which maintained continuous surveillance of the Levantine corridors, immediately identified these clandestine communications as a coordinated conspiracy. The failure to provide the expected revenue provided the northern monarchy with a legal and moral justification for the total liquidation of the Israelite state. This act of defiance was classified as a fundamental breach of the vassalage agreement, necessitating a decisive response to maintain the integrity of the provincial tax system. The resulting confrontation was no longer a localized dispute over tribute amounts, but a total war intended to permanently remove the rebellious administration. This miscalculation accelerated the transition from supervised autonomy to a state of total siege, as the imperial legions were redirected toward the Israelite capital with the objective of absolute conquest. The diplomatic pivot toward the Nile Delta represented a shift from passive vassalage to active geopolitical realignment, targeting the only sovereign power capable of matching the Assyrian military presence. This clandestine engagement involved the dispatch of high-ranking Israelite officials to establish a formal military convention with the ruling factions of Lower Egypt. The primary objective was to secure an immediate deployment of Egyptian chariotry and infantry to the Levantine theater, which would provide the Sumerian administration with the necessary leverage to ignore imperial fiscal demands. For the Egyptian dynasties, a partnership with the northern kingdom of Israel offered a strategic advantage, as it maintained a necessary buffer zone against the southward encroachment of the Mesopotamian legions toward the Sinai Peninsula. However, the political landscape of Egypt during the late 8th century BC was characterized by significant administrative fragmentation, with power divided among several localized dynasties in the Delta and the rising influence of the Kushite monarchy from the south. This internal disunity prevented the Egyptian state from functioning as a cohesive military ally. While the Israelite envoys sought an absolute security guarantee from a ruler identified in contemporary records as so, likely a reference to the administrative center of Suez or a local dynast, the Egyptian response remained limited to vague diplomatic assurances. The Egyptian military apparatus lacked the logistical readiness and unified command required to execute a trans-regional expeditionary campaign against a professionalized Assyrian force. The failure of this alliance was compounded by the superior intelligence capabilities of the Assyrian state. The imperial administration maintained a dense network of informants and specialized couriers along the primary trade routes, allowing the central government to monitor the movement of foreign delegations with high precision. Intercepted communications between Samaria and the Egyptian Delta provided the legal evidence required for the Assyrian monarch to declare a state of total insurrection. This discovery removed any remaining possibility for a negotiated settlement, as the empire viewed the secret treaty as a terminal betrayal of the existing world order. By the time the Sumerian court realized that Egyptian support would not materialize, the Assyrian legions were already mobilized for a final punitive strike against the Israelite capital. The administration of a vast territorial expanse necessitated a centralized archival system and a high-speed communication infrastructure to process and categorize regional threats. In the imperial capital, the central bureaucracy maintained a department specifically dedicated to the analysis of provincial correspondence and the verification of vassal loyalty. This institution functioned as the analytical center for a network of official agents who utilized a relay system of fresh horses and dedicated way stations to ensure that reports reached the sovereign within days of their drafting. This logistical capability allowed the state to maintain a state of permanent surveillance over the distant Levantine corridors, effectively shrinking the geographic distance between the central throne and its frontiers. The recognition of the Northern Kingdom's rebellion was documented through the official categorization of recovered diplomatic materials as evidence of a terminal breach of law. The imperial scribes utilized a standardized system of filing and cross-referencing to compare the current activities of the vassal with the historical records of his previous oaths of submission. This administrative verification transformed a singular act of defiance into a legally recognized invalidation of the entire imperial contract. The central government did not rely on anecdotal evidence, but on the physical recovery of sealed documentation intended for the southern dynasties. These materials were archived in the royal library, serving as the permanent justification for the subsequent military campaign. The efficiency of this information cycle ensured that the royal court could authorize a mobilization before the Northern Israelite administration had completed its own defensive preparations. The speed of the response was a direct result of the integration between the intelligence department and the military high command. By the time the decree for invasion was issued from the capital, the imperial staff already possessed detailed maps of the Sumerian fortifications and up-to-date reports on the kingdom's food and water reserves. This state of informational superiority meant that the ensuing conflict was not a battle between equal powers, but the systematic execution of a pre-planned administrative liquidation. The discovery of the conspiracy finalized the transition from diplomatic oversight to a state of total war, ensuring that the northern tribes would be dealt with according to the strict protocols governing rebellious provinces. The transition of imperial leadership to Shalmaneser V in 727 BC necessitated a decisive reassertion of northern authority over the Levantine vassal states. Upon the verification of the northern kingdom's political and fiscal defiance, the monarch authorized the assembly of the primary imperial strike force at the strategic junction of the Middle Euphrates. This mobilization was not an isolated disciplinary action, but a comprehensive operational shift designed to eliminate the northern Hebrew state as a political entity. The imperial command issued orders for the movement of heavy infantry and specialized logistics units toward the western coast, utilizing the established military roads to ensure rapid deployment. Unlike previous regional incursions, this campaign prioritized the total isolation of the rebellious territory from its potential foreign support networks in the south. The military movement was characterized by the systematic occupation of the northern kingdom's secondary urban centers and the destruction of its remaining border defenses. By securing the major transit routes through the Galilee and the northern highlands, the imperial forces effectively paralyzed the domestic economy and prevented any large-scale tribal assembly. These initial operations served to funnel the remaining Israelite resistance into the capital city, Samaria, while the imperial navy secured the coastal access points to prevent Egyptian maritime intervention. The administrative goal was the creation of a physical and informational blockade, stripping the Sumerian court of its ability to coordinate with provincial governors. The mobilization also involved the procurement of massive quantities of grain and forage from newly annexed territories to support a multi-year operation. This foresight allowed the legions to maintain a continuous presence in the field, independent of the seasonal agricultural cycle. The Imperial High Command focused on the construction of fortified base camps at key intervals along the Sumerian border, creating a perimeter of containment. This strategic preparation ensured that the final phase of the campaign would be a controlled and deliberate process of elimination, rather than a spontaneous conflict. The launch of this invasion signaled the official termination of the diplomatic phase, as the state transitioned into a period of total military occupation. The military blockade of the capital commenced with the construction of a continuous line of circumvallation, a technique intended to prevent any physical escape or the entry of emergency provisions. This perimeter was monitored by permanent sentry posts stationed at intervals around the city's base, effectively severing the urban center from its productive agricultural hinterland. The imperial forces utilized their logistical superiority to establish a self-sustaining environment for the besieging army, ensuring that the blockade remained effective through multiple seasonal cycles. This encirclement transformed the administrative hub into a high-density prison where the survival of the inhabitants was entirely dependent on existing stockpile reserves. Throughout the 36-month period, the Imperial engineers applied constant mechanical pressure against the city's structural defenses. While direct assault was occasionally utilized to test the resolve of the defenders, the primary objective was the exhaustion of the city's internal resources. The use of specialized projectiles and the systematic destruction of external cisterns outside the wall ensured that the water security of the population was compromised. This period of attrition forced the Sumerian administration to implement drastic internal rationing protocols, leading to a steady decline in the physical readiness of the domestic garrison. The imperial command maintained a policy of psychological warfare, displaying the fate of provincial captives in view of the city walls to discourage continued resistance. Early in the conflict, the reigning monarch Hoshea was apprehended by imperial agents, leaving the city under the governance of a headless military council. This capture removed the primary diplomatic representative of the state, ensuring that no further negotiations with southern powers or the Egyptian Delta could be conducted. The city functioned as a closed system, devoid of external intelligence or the possibility of reinforcement. The duration of the siege reflects the formidable nature of Samaria's stone fortifications and the depth of its initial grain reserves. Yet the lack of an exit strategy ensured that the final outcome was determined by the laws of resource depletion. By the third year, the internal social order was severely compromised by malnutrition and disease, facilitating the eventual breach of the final defensive layer. The duration of the blockade between 725 and 722 BC initiated a terminal phase of biological and social degradation within the Israelite capital. As the encirclement persisted through 6 consecutive harvest seasons, the population was denied the ability to replenish its essential nutritional stores, leading to the inevitable exhaustion of long-term grain silos. This scarcity was exacerbated by the massive influx of displaced persons from the northern provincial districts who had sought refuge behind the city's stone walls during the initial invasion. The resulting demographic density placed an unsustainable strain on the urban sanitation systems and communal housing, facilitating the rapid transmission of infectious diseases throughout the dense residential quarters. Without access to fresh medicinal supplies or external waste management, the public health of the city underwent a catastrophic collapse, significantly reducing the effective manpower of the domestic garrison. The administrative structure of Samaria was forced to prioritize the distribution of dwindling rations to the military elite, creating a state of internal social fragmentation and class-based friction. As the caloric intake of the general populace fell below survival levels, the civil order that had once supported the royal administration began to dissolve into localized disputes over basic survival commodities. The lack of combustible fuel for cooking and heating further compromised the resilience of the inhabitants during the winter months, leading to high rates of mortality among the non-combatant population. This state of internal atrophy was not the result of a single tactical failure, but the cumulative impact of a 3-year severance from the kingdom's productive base. The psychological impact of total informational isolation prevented the defenders from gauging the status of their southern neighbors or the movements of their failed allies. This uncertainty undermined the collective will to maintain expensive defensive protocols, as the leadership could provide no timeline for relief. The physical weakening of the defenders meant that the maintenance of heavy weaponry and the manning of high battlements became increasingly difficult. By the final stage of the blockade, the city was no longer a functioning political hub, but a collection of starving districts incapable of resisting a sustained breach. The transition from a fortified stronghold to a state of biological insolvency ensured that the eventual imperial entry would encounter minimal organized resistance, as the defenders lacked the physical strength to wield the weapons of the previous century. The structural integrity of the Sumerian fortifications finally succumbed to the sustained application of imperial siege technology in late 722 BC. After 36 months of continuous mechanical vibration and intensive subterranean tunneling, the primary stone curtain wall experienced a terminal collapse, creating a significant aperture in the city's northern sector. The imperial shock infantry, utilizing their technological superiority in close-quarters combat, exploited this opening to neutralize the remaining domestic sentries. Organized resistance within the city evaporated as the fragmented internal command, already depleted by the extended blockade, failed to mobilize a final defensive engagement within the urban center. This military entry marked the definitive conclusion of the Northern Kingdom's armed opposition, as the professional legion secured the royal precinct and the primary administrative archives. Contemporary records indicate that while the initial investment of the city was directed by Shalmaneser V, The final liquidation of the state was presided over by his successor, Sargon II. This transition in leadership did not delay the administrative processing of the vanquished capital. Instead, the new monarch utilized the victory to consolidate his domestic authority and validate his own imperial mandate. The systematic dismantling of the Israelite governmental apparatus commenced immediately upon the securing of the city gates. Imperial officials conducted a rigorous inventory of the residual assets within the palace, cataloging luxury items, including carved ivory inlays and silver vessels, for transport to the central treasury. The conquest was finalized through the formal closure of the national sanctuaries, which had served as the institutional pillars of the Northern Kingdom's separate identity. By terminating these religious and political hubs, the imperial administration signaled the absolute end of tribal autonomy in the region. The city was officially placed under the jurisdiction of a royal governor, who assumed the responsibilities previously held by the Israelite monarchy. This transfer of authority was verified through the installation of a permanent imperial garrison within the city's heights, ensuring that the former capital would henceforth function solely as a provincial administrative node. The fall of the city transformed a sovereign territory into a conquered asset, ending the centuries of political independence for the northern tribes and preparing the site for a complete demographic overhaul. The ascension of Sargon II in 722 BC coincided with the final operational phase of the Sumerian campaign, allowing the new monarch to utilize the city's fall as the primary validation of his imperial legitimacy. While the investment of the capital began under his predecessor, Sargon II's official annals at Dur-Sharrukin explicitly claim the victory and the subsequent reorganization of the territory as his own personal achievement. This narrative shift served a critical internal purpose, as the monarch sought to establish a prestigious military reputation to secure his position against potential domestic rivals. The conquest was framed not as a continuation of previous policy, but as a fresh manifestation of Sargon's divine mandate and administrative competence. This historical claim effectively linked the beginning of his reign with a total elimination of the most significant northern obstacle to Assyrian expansion. The formalization of the conquest involved the creation of the province of Samarina, an administrative district that replaced the political infrastructure of the former Israelite kingdom. Sargon II appointed high-ranking Assyrian officials to oversee the daily governance of the region, ensuring that the local tax systems were fully integrated into the imperial bureaucracy. His inscriptions provide the specific tally of the displaced population, detailing the removal of exactly 27,290 individuals, which included the elite families and specialized professionals of the capital. This precise record-keeping was a hallmark of Sargon's governance, reflecting a transition from purely military operations to a rigorous census-driven administration. The king also mandated the restoration of the city, but with a fundamentally different purpose, converting it into a regional logistical hub designed to support further expansion toward the southern border. Furthermore, Sargon II utilized the fall of Samaria to announce a broader geopolitical doctrine that emphasized the total absorption of the Levant into the Assyrian heartland. By publicizing the total dismantling of the Israelite state in monumental stone reliefs, the monarch signaled to remaining regional powers that the era of semi-autonomous vassalage had ended. The victory provided the resources necessary to fund the construction of a new royal residence, linking the wealth of the conquered Hebrews to the architectural grandeur of the empire. This period of triumph marked the official closure of the Israelite political chapter and the commencement of Sargon's long-term strategy to dominate the Mediterranean coastline, establishing a precedent for the total administrative erasure of rebellious sovereign states. The fall of Samaria represented the terminal legal dissolution of the Israelite state, a process that effectively erased the kingdom from the international political order. For over 2 centuries, the northern monarchy had maintained a distinct diplomatic existence, recognized by neighboring powers through formal treaties and strategic alliances. With the collapse of the central administration in 722 BC, this status was officially rescinded. The kingdom's independent judicial and legislative functions were terminated, and the royal hierarchy that had provided the state with its political continuity was forcibly removed from the historical record. This transition was not merely a change in government, but the total liquidation of a national identity as defined by its sovereign institutions and territorial boundaries. The primary markers of statehood, including the right to collect domestic taxes for local use and the authority to maintain a separate military defense, were transferred to the imperial bureaucracy. The physical instruments of governance, such as royal signet rings, official weights, and measuring standards, were confiscated or destroyed, replaced by the standardized tools of the Assyrian provincial system. This administrative erasure ensured that no local official could issue a decree in the name of an Israelite monarch. The kingdom's former borders, which had been defined by tribal inheritance and historical military conquest, were reorganized to suit the logistical requirements of the empire. This restructuring eliminated the geographic coherence of the 10 tribes, fragmenting the land into smaller, manageable zones of control that lacked any connection to the previous national structure. Furthermore, the kingdom's participation in international trade networks was stripped of its sovereign protections. While the region remained economically active, its commerce was now conducted under the legal framework of the Assyrian state, with all profits and tolls directed to the central treasury. The loss of sovereignty meant that the inhabitants no longer possessed a legal mechanism to appeal the decisions of the imperial governor or to seek redress through local tribal courts. The northern kingdom of Israel ceased to exist as a signatory of treaties or as a participant in regional diplomacy. By 721 BC, the political entity had been effectively purged from the geopolitical landscape, leaving the region as a mere administrative asset of a distant power. The formal issuance of the Edict of Removal by Sargon II in the immediate aftermath of Samaria's collapse served as the definitive legal instrument for the systematic liquidation of the Israelite population. This decree was not an arbitrary act of post-war retribution, but a codified administrative procedure designed to initiate the permanent demographic restructuring of the Levant. The edict mandated the immediate mobilization of the imperial bureaucratic apparatus to conduct a comprehensive census of the remaining inhabitants, categorizing individuals based on their professional skills, social status, and military potential. By documenting the population in this manner, the Assyrian state ensured that the extraction process would be orderly, exhaustive, and aligned with the long-term economic requirements of the Mesopotamian heartland. The implementation of the decree prioritized the removal of the foundational pillars of Israelite society, specifically the landed aristocracy, the priesthood, and the professional officer class. This targeted extraction was intended to achieve a state of permanent social decapitation, stripping the 10 tribes of the leadership necessary to organize any future political or military resurgence. The edict also specified the logistical protocols for the deportation, including the assignment of specialized military units to oversee the transport of thousands of families across the imperial road network. These units were responsible for the security and maintenance of the deportees, ensuring that the human capital of the conquered kingdom reached its assigned destinations in the eastern provinces without significant loss of life, which would have diminished the value of the state's new assets. Legally, the Edict of Removal functioned as the formal termination of the ancient system of tribal land inheritance. By decreeing the total vacancy of the strategic urban centers and the fertile highlands, the Assyrian monarch effectively invalidated the traditional property rights that had defined the region for centuries. The land was reclassified as royal property, and the legal status of the inhabitants was transformed from sovereign citizens to subjects of the imperial relocation program. This administrative erasure ensured that the physical removal of the people was matched by a total legal dissolution of their connection to the territory. The execution of this edict finalized the transition from a state of military conquest to a state of permanent demographic displacement, marking the commencement of the final march for the 10 tribes and the end of their historical tenure in the land of Israel. The primary evidence for the scale of the Israelite displacement is preserved within the monumental inscriptions discovered at Dur Sharukin, the imperial capital constructed by Sargon II. These archaeological records, recovered from the ruins of the royal palace at Khorsabad, contain meticulous bureaucratic summaries of the king's military achievements during his first regnal year. The most significant statistical detail provided by these texts is the specific tally of 27,290 individuals removed from the Sumerian region. This precise figure indicates that the Assyrian administrative apparatus conducted a rigorous accounting of the human assets extracted from the conquered territory. Unlike earlier punitive raids that relied on general descriptions of victory, the Sargonid era was defined by this level of granular data, which was intended to demonstrate the king's total control over the demographic resources of the Levant. The inscriptions further specify that the deportees were not a random cross-section of the population, but were selected based on their utility to the central government. The records highlight the seizure of 50 chariots, which were immediately integrated into the Assyrian professional army. This detail confirms that the northern kingdom possessed a significant technological infrastructure that the empire sought to absorb. The archival texts also describe the redistribution of these captives to specific eastern provinces, providing a roadmap for the demographic erasure of the 10 tribes. By recording these numbers on the walls of the royal residence, the Assyrian state transformed a military event into a permanent administrative fact. The discovery of these inscriptions in the mid-19th century provided the first non-biblical verification of the fall of Samaria and the subsequent mass deportation. The texts serve as a primary source for understanding the transition of the Northern Kingdom from a regional political entity to a quantified line item in the imperial ledger. The tally also provides a baseline for evaluating the survival of the remaining peasantry, who were left behind to maintain the agricultural output of the newly formed province. This systematic documentation ensured that the memory of the Northern Kingdom's sovereignty was replaced by a statistical record of its liquidation, preserving the scale of the expulsion for future imperial administrators and modern historians alike. The selection process for the 722 BC removal was specifically engineered to extract the intellectual, technical, and managerial sectors of Israelite society. By targeting the literate bureaucracy, the Assyrian administration ensured that the surviving provincial population lacked the capacity for complex record-keeping or legal coordination. The removal of the scribal class effectively terminated the continuity of local administrative law and historical documentation within the Sumerian highlands. This systematic extraction left the remaining peasantry without a governing hierarchy capable of collecting internal taxes or managing communal resources, rendering the region entirely dependent on the newly installed foreign governors for basic social organization. The loss of the artisan class represented a terminal blow to the Northern Kingdom's industrial and architectural capabilities. Skilled metalworkers, masons, and weavers, who had previously maintained the kingdom's prestige and defensive hardware, were relocated to serve the construction needs of the Assyrian imperial capitals. This transfer of human capital meant that the infrastructure left in the province of Samarina could no longer be repaired or upgraded by local hands. The specialized knowledge required for the maintenance of advanced hydraulic systems and fortified masonry was effectively exported, leading to a rapid decline in the technical standard of living for the non-deported population. Furthermore, the professional military caste, including high-ranking officers and tactical specialists, was integrated into the imperial army to serve in distant theaters. This strategic removal ensured that no experienced military leadership remained to train a local militia or organize an insurgency. The departure of these professional soldiers meant that the weapons and tactical doctrines of the former kingdom were erased from the local collective memory. The remaining population consisted primarily of unskilled agricultural laborers who lacked the cohesion and strategic training necessary to challenge the professional Assyrian garrisons. By removing these specific functional groups, the empire achieved a state of strategic decapitation, ensuring that the former kingdom became a compliant and technically stagnant province that posed no future security risk to the central government. The physical relocation of the northern Israelite population was facilitated by the standardized imperial transport corridors that connected the Levantine coast to the Mesopotamian heartland. This movement was not a disorganized migration, but a supervised logistical operation conducted along a network of established military roads and way stations. The forced march commenced from the assembly points outside the ruins of Samaria, moving northward through the Orontes River Valley before turning eastward toward the primary crossing points of the Euphrates. The scale of this movement required the coordinated effort of the Assyrian Transport Ministry, which managed the distribution of rations and the maintenance of the pack animals necessary to carry the state's confiscated assets. The journey spanned several months and covered thousands of kilometers, traversing various climatic zones that differed significantly from the Mediterranean environment of the northern highlands. The deportees were subject to a rigorous daily pace dictated by the military escort, with stops limited to the official supply depots, where imperial granaries provided the minimum caloric requirements for the marchers. Historical evidence suggests that the captives moved in family units, carrying their remaining personal effects on their persons, or in ox-drawn carts provided for the transport of heavy baggage. This method of movement ensured that the population remained physically exhausted and geographically disoriented, minimizing the risk of a mass desertion or coordinated return to the southern border. Upon crossing the Euphrates, the columns were divided and redirected toward specialized resettlement zones in the eastern provinces. This geographic dispersion was a critical component of the isolation strategy, as it prevented the formation of a single, large Israelite enclave within the empire. Significant groups were funneled into the Kaba River Valley in Upper Mesopotamia, while others were marched further east into the rugged terrain of the Zagros Mountains. The transition from the fertile hills of the Levant to the arid plains and high-altitude plateaus of the interior served as a physical barrier to cultural continuity. By the time the deportees reached their assigned destinations, the immense distance from their ancestral lands had effectively compromised their ability to maintain communication with the remaining Hebrew tribes in the south. This physical separation was the primary mechanism of the diaspora, ensuring that the 10 tribes were integrated into the vast and unfamiliar landscape of the imperial frontier. The imperial administration identified specific topographical and political zones for the permanent placement of the northern tribes, prioritizing regions that were either underutilized or required a professionalized military presence to secure the frontier. Hala, situated in the upper reaches of the Mesopotamian plain, functioned as a primary site for the resettlement of the specialized labor classes. Archaeological findings in the vicinity of the Kaba River, specifically at the site of Haber, indicate that the displaced population was integrated into an existing provincial network centered around the regional capital of Gozan. This river system was a critical agricultural and logistical node, where the newcomers were tasked with maintaining the grain production levels required to support the permanent northern garrisons. The placement of these families in the Haber region ensured that their technical skills contributed directly to the state's provincial infrastructure. The second major destination involved the relocation of significant units to the eastern frontier, specifically within the administrative jurisdiction of the Medes. This area, located in the high-altitude districts of the Zagros Range, represented the furthest edge of the empire's stable governance during the late 8th century BC. The stationing of Israelite military personnel in these border cities served as a strategic countermeasure against the emerging power of the eastern mountain tribes. By utilizing foreign captives to man these sensitive frontier outposts, the Assyrian state minimized the risk of collusion between the local garrison and the indigenous population. The integration of these exiles into the Median provincial system is corroborated by the presence of Hebrew names in official administrative lists, confirming their status as tax-paying subjects and auxiliary combatants. The geographic separation between the groups in Upper Mesopotamia and those in the Median cities was a deliberate administrative move to ensure the terminal fragmentation of the tribal identity. Unlike the southern exiles of later eras, who were often concentrated in specific urban enclaves, the northern population was absorbed into the diverse ethnic mosaic of the Eastern Empire. This demographic dilution meant that the unique cultural markers of the 10 tribes were effectively submerged within the larger imperial bureaucracy. The legal and social structures of Habor and the Median cities were designed for total assimilation, offering no legal mechanism for the preservation of a separate national identity. Consequently, these resettlement zones became the final functional sites of the Northern Kingdom's population, where the people were converted into permanent demographic assets of the Mesopotamian crown. The implementation of the Great Replacement in 721 BC represented the final administrative act in the transformation of the Northern Highlands into a permanent imperial province. To prevent the strategic vacuum created by the mass expulsion of the 10 tribes, the Assyrian bureaucracy initiated a reverse migration, funneling diverse groups from the eastern and northern reaches of the empire into the vacated urban centers. These newcomers originated from the defeated urban centers of Babylon, Cutha, and Ava, as well as the northern Syrian city of Hamath and the region of Sepharvaim. This repopulation was a calculated fiscal maneuver intended to preserve the state's tax base by ensuring that the extensive olive groves and vineyards of the Ephraimite hills remained under active cultivation. The imperial crown viewed the land not as a national territory, but as a revenue-generating asset that required a functional, though non-native, labor force. The arrival of these disparate ethnic groups introduced a fractured cultural and religious landscape to the region formerly known as the Kingdom of Israel. These settlers brought their own specialized agricultural techniques and local administrative traditions, which were gradually superimposed upon the residual infrastructure of the previous regime. The resulting social structure was characterized by a lack of historical continuity with the previous inhabitants, as the new residents established sanctuaries dedicated to their own ancestral deities. This demographic layering created a permanent sociological barrier between the northern province and the southern kingdom of Judah, as the ethnic composition of the north became increasingly heterogeneous. The central government facilitated this integration by providing the new arrivals with legal protections and land grants, effectively tethering their survival to the continued presence of the Assyrian military. Over time, this policy of forced settlement produced a hybrid society that functioned as a loyalist enclave within the Levantine corridor. The linguistic diversity of the new population served as a natural deterrent to the re-emergence of a unified Hebrew nationalist movement, as the various groups possessed no shared historical grievances or ancestral ties to the land. This transition from a tribal kingdom to a multi-ethnic colony was finalized by the reconstruction of Samaria as a cosmopolitan administrative hub. By the conclusion of this repopulation phase, the Northern Territory had been successfully neutralized, its former identity replaced by a complex provincial culture that owed its existence and legal standing to the Mesopotamian throne. The biological and cultural synthesis that followed the Assyrian repopulation efforts created a distinct ethnographic group known as the Samaritans, whose identity was forged through the forced integration of local and foreign elements. While the imperial administration had removed the urban elite and professional classes, a substantial portion of the rural Israelite population remained in the countryside to maintain agricultural productivity. These indigenous farmers, primarily from the lower social strata, were compelled to exist alongside the diverse settlers who had been relocated from the eastern and northern provinces of the empire. Over several generations, the lack of traditional social barriers and the shared necessity of survival led to widespread intermarriage and the blurring of ancestral distinctions. This process transformed the region into a demographic crucible where the remnants of the 10 tribes were absorbed into a new, multi-ethnic social fabric. Central to this emergence was the development of a hybrid religious system that blended the ancestral traditions of the land with the varied practices of the newcomers. Historical accounts indicate that the new settlers, struggling to adapt to the ecological challenges of the northern highlands, sought instruction in the local rites to appease the provincial deity. This resulted in the appointment of a local priesthood that facilitated the transmission of Hebrew religious law to the foreign population. However, this instruction did not lead to the total abandonment of the settlers' original customs. Instead, it produced a unique form of worship characterized by the coexistence of diverse rituals. This religious blending became a defining feature of the Samaritan community, distinguishing them from the more rigid developments occurring in the southern kingdom of Judah. The resulting population occupied a unique and often isolated position within the Near Eastern political landscape. They were viewed by the Assyrian governors as loyal provincial subjects who provided the stability and taxes necessary to maintain the province of Samarina. Conversely, the southern Judean authorities increasingly regarded the residents of the north as a compromised and foreign people, leading to a permanent sectarian rift. This social and religious divergence solidified during the centuries of imperial oversight, as the Samaritans developed their own version of the ancient texts and established a centralized sanctuary on Mount Gerizim. The birth of the Samaritans thus marked the final transformation of the Northern Territory from a Hebrew tribal kingdom into a permanent, mixed heritage society that retained elements of the ancient past while embracing a new, imperial-driven identity. If you found this history interesting, this next video will shock you. Click right here to watch it now.